So let's start by setting our motivation for the evening. So in this world, in this moment, there are so many things going on, and it's very likely that some people are in a great deal of suffering and don't really have any way to work with it very well. And when I think of that, I feel quite both sad and also just appreciative of having had the opportunity to really get on track with excellent Dharma teachings and Dharma teachers. And I think it's important to, for me, to keep that suffering in mind, and keep in mind that the kind of topics that we're talking about tonight are the real solution to freeing myself, freeing others from this suffering. And so as we finish with these 6 far-reaching practices, we can really rejoice that these teachings exist in the world, that they're complete. We have the opportunity that we do just now, healthy of body and mind, enough to take these teachings in and work on our minds. And let's think about how wonderful it would be if everyone we knew, and everyone that they knew, and our families, and this whole wave of peace and happiness were able to fill all of space, and all of the various problems would be completely gone, and all suffering would be ended. So to see how there is an end to suffering, and to spend our time tonight endeavoring to understand how that might be. And so may we become Buddhas and have many, many connections with just so many beings, so that we can help them to be free of every suffering. So, kind of the plan for the night. We're going to be talking about far-reaching meditative stabilization and far-reaching wisdom. And so I'll talk a little bit about each of those, just kind of briefly, really. And then I want to delve into topics that relate to these from a practice perspective, from a book called Stages of Meditation by Kamala Shila, and His Holiness, his commentary on that. And the reason I chose this book is because it's really very much in line with this whole series that we've been talking about, with the Mahayana vehicle and the fundamental vehicle. It has, the text covers that, the essence of the path of those, and it covers the 6 perfections, which we're talking about the last few weeks, and bodhicitta. But its emphasis is on calm abiding and special insight, which are basically the topics tonight. So it's kind of the perfect book. But the other thing I quite starting to appreciate about it is, which I kind of flew over my head the first time I read this, is that when His Holiness gave his commentary on this, he was saying, well, you know, those of you who are new to Buddhism, not so much familiar with these things, this book is like the key. It can be like a key, because if you can understand the topics in this book, it opens you up to all of the major Buddhist scriptures. That's what he said. And so he said, try to have a coherent understanding of this text. And then based on that knowledge, you'll be able to understand other texts. And that's the part I keyed into. But what I didn't really notice until I went back was that he said, for those of you who are new to Buddhism and not familiar with the modes of procedures of practicing the teachings, and that's what I'm finding in this book that's so nice, is it's a practice manual. It's not a philosophical text. It covers, it delves into these topics, but it comes at it from the standpoint of practice. And so there's a lot of really good advice. And so I didn't get through the whole book, and I don't really plan on talking a lot about emptiness. And but I want to share the things that I think set the basis for being able to understand these topics. So that's kind of the plan. And so starting with far-reaching meditative stabilization, so this is the ability to concentrate or have a one-pointedness of mind, and we develop it through 9 stages, and that leads to serenity or shamatha. So this one-pointedness, this is the ability to focus single-mindedly on any object that we choose, and with complete mental stability and clarity. And all of us now have some ability in this regard, and we have the capacity, all of us in this room have the capacity to develop this completely. And so we have to, know that. It may take us lifetimes, but we have that capacity. We have to think of this as just something that's not really developed and put ourselves to the task. And I've read much more about meditative stabilization than far-reaching wisdom, I would say. So if you have questions, you might fall better to that side. That's my caveat. And I think I've had reasons why I've needed to do that, to look into that, because I spent a lot of years doing meditation without proper instruction, and so I've really had to be convinced of a few things, and that's why I also find this text helpful. And those are the things we'll cover tonight. So this concentration, it is really enhancing for our practice, because then we can be more clear, we can focus consistently on any object that we want, and we can do this without any kind of distraction or lethargy, so we won't be like zoning out, falling asleep, or running off to Hawaii or while we're on the cushion. So, but this isn't a practice that is uniquely Buddhist. The different abilities to be able to focus the mind single-pointedly are found in Buddhists and non-Buddhists. And so what we're studying right now, the grounds and paths, so what makes this a bodhisattva practice? Because it in itself, concentration isn't a bodhisattva practice alone. What makes it a bodhisattva practice is when we base this practice on our refuge in the Triple Gem, and when we have the motivation of bodhicitta. And then with that, we have the motivation to actualize the wisdom that realizes emptiness, so that we can become fully enlightened. And one topic that isn't quite prevalent in this book is omniscience, which I found quite helpful, and we'll speak a little bit about tonight. So that's what makes this a bodhisattva practice. And so how do we go about gaining this serenity? Well, as we've learned from our teachers on the 3 higher trainings, we have to have ethical conduct, or else we'll just be spending our time sitting on the cushion, kind of working on our minds for the rest of our life for all our negativities. We'll be distracted by all of that. So we need to have good ethical conduct, and through that learn to have pure habits and behaviors, and we have to accumulate merit. So once we gain serenity, this is actually the basis for us to develop special insight. And that is special insight into emptiness. So that's just a little bit about, just a brief introduction to meditative stabilization. What we read when we study our stages of the path in the Lam Rim, it says, "Inspire me to perfect far-reaching meditative stability by abandoning the faults of laxity, excitement, and wandering, and by meditating with single-pointed absorption on the ultimate nature, the emptiness of true existence of all phenomena. So that's kind of our goal in terms of the meditative stabilization. Now, in terms of far-reaching wisdom, there are a few types of that. There's the wisdom that understands emptiness, which is how we will reach enlightenment or full awakening. But there also are other wisdoms. There's wisdom of the 5 fields of knowledge, which are typically expressed as things like logic and grammar, but basically, in other topics, but basically, bodhisattvas need to learn whatever is going to be beneficial for sentient beings. And so we can't just have the wisdom understanding the true nature of all phenomena or to understand emptiness. As bodhisattvas, we need to have the wisdom where we can help other people. So in far-reaching wisdom, there are a few types. And another one, and basically they are wisdoms that can be a benefit to sentient beings. So in order for us to put ourselves in a position where we would be interested in all of this, of going the distance, I guess I would say, we have to start with understanding the nature of suffering and wanting to be free of that. So renunciation, this compassion that we have for ourselves. And we have to develop an interest in bodhicitta. So when we have those two, that's not enough either, though, because it's like the 3 principal aspects of the path. These are all the renunciation, bodhicitta, and wisdom. Our practice should always be revolving around these 3 areas. This is something that Venerable Chodron has taught, and it's also something that His Holiness mentions in the commentary here. So even as we think about meditative stabilization and wisdom, it's not like we're going to leave everything else aside. We will always want our practice to revolve around those 3 topics. We try to balance out our study and our contemplation and our meditation. And if you think about it, you have to have all of those, or you won't really travel the full distance. Sure, the 3 principal aspects of the path are renunciation, the determination to be free from cyclic existence, and then bodhicitta, and then this wisdom, the wisdom that understands emptiness. So far-reaching wisdom for Arya Bodhisattva, when they directly perceive emptiness, this is something for a bodhisattva that is supported by the method side of the path, and in particular by the motivation of bodhicitta. So they're different from the fundamental vehicle, like the hearers and the solitary realizers. They're different in that way. So there are practitioners who have not entered the bodhisattva path, and they might have that kind of wisdom, this non-dual wisdom, but it won't be the perfection of wisdom. The perfection of wisdom refers to the bodhisattva path, and so it's supported, and that only arises after having cultivated spontaneous bodhicitta. Yeah, so that's what makes it far-reaching. And so when we talk about the kind of wisdom that in Buddhism, I think it's good to, it's not like when we went to school. It's not about having a high IQ. It's really what they teach when they teach about the qualities of a student. It's not about being good at taking tests or writing and regurgitating kind of mentality. Really, as a student, what we need to be open-minded and then have an ability to learn and analyze clearly and have sincere spiritual aspirations and then have created enough merit. So that's the kind of development that we want to have. So this wisdom is not like high IQ. It's more like a focus and a power. And even our effort for spiritual advancement. So that's how we want to be thinking about this. It's easy in Buddhism to get caught up with and almost fascinated by the teachings themselves and all the numbers and the lists and everything, but that's not what it's about. And so when you ask, well, how do you go about this? How do you attain this? The directions, the guidance we're given is to follow our teacher's instructions, to proper practicely, and then develop the wisdoms of listening, contemplating, and meditating. And that's basically the method in Buddhism. And to also not to sell ourselves short and to realize that our, we might say, intelligence, this is something that can be expanded upon. We can grow, we can learn, and our understanding and all these things can deepen. So that's more just a little intro to far-reaching wisdom and some thoughts about that. So it's very far away from intellectual learning, although we use the intellect. So now we'll go just to some topics from Kamalashila, who is from the 9th century, and really is a book about becoming enlightened. It goes into the method qualities, and it goes into the wisdom qualities. So it's the method side of the path, as we've learned, that these qualities that will allow us to, to produce the physical body of a Buddha. This allows us then to be able to work for the welfare of sentient beings. And the wisdom qualities produce the wisdom body of a Buddha. And this allows us to achieve our own purposes. We have to have wisdom to liberate ourselves, but it's through the other kind of abilities and qualities that we have that we actually help others. So what I noticed in this book, I was going to kind of go to the end and talk mostly about the special insight and meditative stabilization, but as I went through the parts, I realized it was hard for me to drop things out, so I kind of had to give that up at some point. I realized that the ideas flowed from one to another, and they were building and building through the commentary. And then I just was kind of struck by how helpful this was to the different pointers, because it's more like a practice manual. And so then I decided, well, let's just talk about the different topics that, kind of relate, especially since we're going into retreat soon. And a lot of these things to me, it's kind of like you're building the basis here of having a practice that will work. So, okay, so it all starts with compassion. That's the root of bodhicitta. And we have to put this into practice, but we have to do it in conjunction with the wisdom that realizes the ultimate nature of all of phenomena. This wisdom is a union of special insight and a calmly abiding mind. And this single-pointed focus is on an object, and the object is emptiness. When His Holiness gives his commentary, he's actually talking to people who don't have an interest much in religion. And this was really, I found kind of interesting and I thought useful to share. So he kind of goes about showing how you might generate interest in religion and Buddhism in particular. And then he says, there are many lines of reasoning that can help us develop interest in religion. And this is something that, is, I think when a lot of people, even yesterday I was talking with an inmate, the only Buddhist in this group of 350 inmates. And so he meditates in the middle of the night, and people often ask him questions about meditation, and we were talking about people's ideas about meditation. And it was pretty interesting because most people don't think about logical analysis when they think about meditation. And this is His Holiness's point here, is that when we have a spiritual practice, it's not, as Buddhists, it's not one that's just on faith. It's faith based on logic and reason. And so he explains there are two kinds of faith. There's one that's not based on any special reason, and there's one that's backed by reason. And he's encouraging us to head in that direction because it's more stable. You can't really uproot that so easily. And so what is that about? You know, this is where we look at an object of our belief. So we start looking at maybe the teachings or the things we believe about the teachings or the things we believe about the world, and we investigate. You know, what I found interesting in this, because faith is, you know, and confidence in the teachings is something that interests somebody who has doubt. And the way he talked about this was different than how I had thought about this. I think I still had kind of my young mind of there's this truth, and I will have confidence when I understand this truth. But his way of understanding faith, he was saying faith is generated after seeing the reasons why it's advantageous. He's saying, you know, you need to investigate the relevance of what you're learning to your own needs and requirements. And I think when you look at your own life, that's actually kind of what we're doing more. We keep things that work, and we kind of end up eventually tossing out things that don't work. And so it really, that phrase there, you know, really helped me to think about this differently. I found that quite helpful because, I don't know, something in me was always, I guess, thinking that there's this one answer or something that you're going to find. There was, you know, I don't know how to explain that. But to think about faith in terms of my needs and what's relevant to my life and what's working, and, you know, that this is logical because it, I don't know, that's a different way for me to think. I'd never thought about faith in that way. Yeah. I'm not sure if I can articulate that completely because maybe I haven't thought about what I was basing it on. But anyway, so maybe you can think about that too, and we can talk about it. So in Buddhism, we're both expected and encouraged to actually examine the teachings. We don't take things just in blind faith. And so we are encouraged to accept things that are logical and reasonable and then reject teachings that aren't. And that's quite a different approach than many faiths, many religions. So this points us to the fact that logical analysis is quite important in Buddhist scriptures. And then His Holiness explains and goes to some explanation of how, you know, the Buddhist teachings, we don't accept all of them, that he taught provisional teachings, things that need to be interpreted. And then later, 30, 40 pages later, he comes back to that idea when he gets around to talking about the conditions that you need to do a retreat. And we've learned about those before, like you need a place that's quiet and, you know, not a lot of noise, and that you keep your own wants really minimal, you know, like be content, you know, be satisfied easily with just whatever you have, so that you're not always wanting to run around and do things. But then he also focuses on kind of what you would be doing then, and he's basically pointing to the fact that what you're actually doing in a lot of farther, you know, on the path is actually looking at the teachings in terms of the ones that are definitive and the ones that are interpretable. And we actually never, I don't think we think of it that way, but we talk this way all the time in our conversations. We're always pulling apart the teachings this way. We're looking at, you know, like, well, does that make sense? And I don't think that's really it. And, you know, when we study the tenets, we got into this way of thinking. And actually, that's when, because the Buddha did teach 4 different kind of views in terms of 4 tenet systems, a lot of what we're doing there is kind of sifting through these and seeing which one fits and which one's beneficial for our mind and our practice. And so this is a lot of what happens when you meditate and you use logical analysis. And it sounds kind of cold and dry when you say logical analysis, but we have some pretty heated discussions about these things. And so, it's not, don't think logic is always so dry and all that. So he's pretty much exhorting us to, and encouraging us to develop our reasoning capacities and to kind of have a method that's logical. And then actually he presents that throughout this text. And the first way he does this is he talks about blessings and kind of dispels the thoughts that a lot of people have about them. He says, blessings must arise from within your own mind. It's not something that comes from outside. So when your positive qualities in your mind increase and the negative ones decrease, that's what blessing means. In the translation of the Tibetan word for blessing, the meaning of it actually is transforming into magnificent potential. So this means that, it's our practice, it's our own inner work. It's not, when they talk about the blessings of the Lama or the blessings of the Dharma, it's not something really coming from the outside, figuratively, and you might have that idea, but the actual mechanism, what's actually happening is within our own mind, and we do it. It's not given to you. Here's a little wand and boom, you're enlightened. I'm not going to go like that.
Can you repeat that?
It's transforming into magnificent potential. Yeah, it's quite beautiful. And when he explained this, besides just, we oftentimes are focused on kind of our afflictions and trying to abandon afflictions. But I didn't think about this way before, but I really think this is something that I believe, that when you decrease the afflictions and the defilements in the mind, you're actually getting rid of things that are obstructing our wholesome qualities. And so actually just by doing that, they almost naturally can arise then. We of course have to cultivate our wholesome qualities, but I think that's been true in my own experience. Just the removing of afflictions allows things to, without much effort, to, they're ready to bloom. They just need, the constrictions taken off. So this, we're talking then about the knowledge and wisdom, and the main point of this is to establish selflessness. And we have to have single point of concentration to do that, and we have to have the union of special insight and a calmly abiding mind. So what is it, and what is our goal then in all of this? What's the goal of being a Mahayana practitioner? To be a Buddha. Yeah. So, who is a Buddha? The Buddha is someone who possesses all-knowing wisdom that's transcendental. And so, how are we going to get there? We have to understand how we're going to get there. So we have to look at the methods, the means and the methods, and then we have to pursue those in a correct way, in a complete way. And that's basically what the book by Kamalashila is about. So Nagarjuna says, if you wish to attain the unsurpassed enlightenment for yourself and the world, the root is the generation of an altruistic thought that is stable and firm like a mountain, and all-embracing compassion and a transcendent wisdom free of duality. So it's always this motivation. So really our motivation is omniscience. And underlying that is this understanding of suffering and wishing everyone to be free of it. And that's why, like weeks ago when we were starting this whole topic, it all boils down to these three things: compassion, the altruistic thought, and the perfect view. So then, to go about this properly, we need to have realizations. And so this requires that we have some faith in the teachings and access to the teachings, and we have all of those things. We have really a precious human life. We're free of major obstacles. We've met all the factors that we need. You have to have those. We have the opportunity to study both the method side of the path and the wisdom teachings. We have the time to contemplate, and then we have to meditate on their meaning. And then His Holiness says we have to use all these opportunities so that we won't have cause for regret in the future and we don't prove unkind to ourselves. And I thought that's a good piece of advice, because if you think of it from a practice way and how we are to ourselves and how we spend our time, I think that's wise to think in this way. I think he's always trying to point out the advantages and the disadvantages, so that because that's really how we work. We operate on that level. And then this quote is kind of central. His Holiness says that he holds this quote quite very dear to his heart, and it kind of puts it all into perspective, the different aspects that we need to have in place. And this is from one of the Kadam Geshe. His name is Sangpua. And so this is really, it strikes at the central theme. And he said, teaching and listening are proper when they are beneficial to the mind. Controlled and disciplined behavior is the sign of having heard teachings. Afflictions are reduced is a sign of meditation. A yogi is the one who understands reality. So if you look at your own practice, then you see, where you are and where you want to go with this. So, so think about it. Teachings are listening to teaching the Dharma and listening to the Dharma are proper when they're beneficial to the mind. So we have to make our mind do that. That's why they teach about the. One thing I quite appreciate is why they teach you how to listen in Buddhism, how to become a good listener. And then when you think about trying to see, well, am I having improvement and what's going on, and your afflictions are still driving you crazy. But if you look at your behaviors, you can see, well, I'm improving, And that's the sign of having heard the teachings. Controlled and disciplined behavior is the sign of having heard teachings. And then when if you're going to expect your afflictions to lessen, then you have to be meditating. People who want to practice and won't make time to get to the cushion, you have to do all three, and that's the sign. And then a yogi is the one who understands reality. So then really you can see that the whole purpose of the Dharma teachings is to discipline our mind. And then he says that it's very difficult. This is one of the difficulties as students is, our minds are so uncontrolled. So we have to make a lot of effort to control our minds. So even when we're just attending teachings, we have to have the desire to be benefited by them. You can't just kind of show up. Your motivation is key. And then we have to make an effort to control our minds, which are like wild elephants running in a china shop. China shop. And then we have to be really diligent to try to integrate things, integrate the teachings into our daily life, into our practice. So we can't think of the teachings and our practice as different things. And that's the big point here. The teachings are just pointers for our practice. And if you can't integrate them, then your practice will actually not be effective. And so that means that we use the Dharma like a mirror, and we examine our own behaviors, our own thoughts, and then we just try to toss out the things that really aren't beneficial. And as we do that, then our good qualities will naturally increase. And what surprised me in this, because I'd never thought of this way, because they have that word propagation of the Dharma, to kind of help the Dharma teachings to spread and increase and flourish and all that, and be restored. But I never thought of it this way. He says this depends on our inner spirit, on our mind continuum. It's not like the Buddhist teachings are something physical. It's our own, when we transform our mind, this is the preservation and the promotion of the Buddhist doctrine. That's quote. I never thought of it that way. So our little practice here is what will keep the teachings going. The first step is to cultivate the positive qualities that the Buddha taught. And of course, we have a lot of afflictions, and that's the major obstacle. But as he says, these have always just caused us a lot of misery. Since beginningless time, our afflictions are just always getting us into trouble. And, when it's funny that when you have an external enemy, you think they're the problem, right? But, they only can bother you in this life. Your afflictions are a much worse enemy. They can bother you for many lives. You're going to carry them on. So that's not the perspective I usually carry throughout the day, I mean, he's getting us ready to be able to understand these other topics. We have to get the basics in mind. So the main criteria for when is our practice being effective? What is the criteria there? Our afflictions are reduced. The kleshas are lessened. That is how we decide if our practice is being effective. It's not how we appear, It's really what's happening on that level. And that's the whole purpose of meditation. To decrease our afflictions and eventually to eradicate them completely. So he says that by learning and practicing the profound and vast aspects of the teaching, a practitioner with prolonged familiarity with and meditation on selflessness will eventually gain an understanding of reality. He didn't say that you'll understand emptiness in 3 months. He said prolonged familiarity with and meditation on selflessness. And then he goes on to teach about the wisdom of listening. And it comes back, and many times in this book, so many of the ideas they repeat. I skimmed the last chapters just to kind of get an idea, and many of the ideas are carried through all the way to the end. Even this one of listening. And so we need to look at ourselves in terms of the 3 pots. Which one are we doing in any moment? Because, this is our job, we have to do this. If you can't recognize the defects that you have in listening, you're not going to have anything to contemplate or meditate on. And we have to listen to a lot of teachings, a yak load of books, they say. And so we want to make our time beneficial. And so we don't want to be like there physically, but not there mentally, like, the upside down pot, nothing goes in. And we don't want to have holes in it where we can't retain anything. And we don't want to poison the teachings with our own afflictions that are going on during a teaching. So only we can do that for ourselves. So it really relates a lot to our motivation, I would say. And then when you think about your motivation, this is where it gets kind of tricky, because it's kind of a thin line sometimes to discern what's a good motivation and what isn't. If you really look closely at your motivations, they're not always so clear. And the line between good ones and not so good ones can be kind of thin at times. So we have to always, one of my teachers has always said that, I've never heard him teach without talking about motivation. It all boils down to motivation. So it's something that we learn to look at and clean up. And then he goes back to the topic of omniscience. I thought about this paragraph quite a bit. I can't say I understand it fully. I'll read it to you. But it was very helpful for me to ponder this for a while. Especially because later on he says, well, do you really, I mean, I'll put it in my words. He says, do you really think that omniscient comes from rocks and trees? Because we kind of have, in our, many people I have met in my life, a real spiritual bent that relates to nature. Like forests and trees and beautiful places. And so when he said that in this book a couple times, like, why is he talking about omniscience and rocks and trees? And I thought about my own history of, spending so much time in the woods and turning to nature for solace, like taking refuge in nature. And so I think when you think about omniscience and the causes of omniscience, I think we need to do this, because if we're going to get there, we better know what brings it about. So he says, it's not possible for omniscience to be produced without causes. Because if it were, everything could always be omniscient. If things were produced without reliance on something else, they could exist without constraint. There would be no reason why everything could not be omniscient. So what he's helping us to do is to understand functional things. Therefore, since all functional things arise only occasionally, they depend strictly on their causes. That's the kind of the point. If we can understand that point, we can understand causality better. Omniscience too is rare because it does not occur at all times and in all cases, and everything cannot become omniscient. Therefore, it definitely depends on causes and conditions.
So what does this omniscience mean? What is the definition?
Omniscience is the transcendental wisdom of a Buddha that understands reality. So it has causes. And so when he explains this, we have the understanding that there are things that exist permanently and some things exist sometimes, but sometimes they don't exist. So what is the implication of this? So really it's that the implication is that temporary things depend on causes. And the fact that things are produced at some times and not at other times actually it proves the existence of causes. And so we have to kind of wrap our minds around this. So that means that certain things that are produced sometimes but not at other times, that means they're not independently produced. They depend on other factors. It's not the way we see things a lot of times. Omniscience isn't just going to like be there. It has causes and conditions. All phenomena that are produced at some times and not at other times depend on causes and conditions. I like thinking about this. It seems kind of simple, but it's not simple in terms of when you think about, if you run into doubt and you wonder about can we really get liberated, and can you really become a Buddha and all that kind of stuff? You have to think these things through. And he's giving us here the keys of the things where we get kind of hung up. And so we have to convince ourselves that everything that's produced, that's functioning, depends on causes and conditions. And then, what is the cause of this? And we have to really just sit on the cushion and think, like when I'm taking refuge in nature, what am I thinking I'm going to get out of that? This is the way I go to with this, because he talked about things with the rocks and the trees, and I just think about what I've done in my life in terms of what I've taken refuge in, and I think, well, what kind of results am I really going to get from the things I'm doing? What kind of causes am I, I look at the things I take refuge in. What is the most, I guess this is pertinent to me because I was quite moved for a long time by the death of someone I never met, but it was famous. And I don't want to name them because it doesn't feel right. But that person was an artist, and so you had an insight into their world through their art, right? And into their, over many decades, through the music and the lyrics and the poetry of it all. And then they died, and you know, I learned some things about their death. And then at that time I was a Buddhist, and I was, you know, when I listened to the lyrics and I, you know, read about this, I was like, you know, the refuge was in trees. I want my ashes to be under this tree. Much of the music had to do with things that related to a kind of different kinds of spirituality. And I don't know, I was quite sad by it, actually, because I was like, you know, I don't know if that's going to work, you know? So this is where I go, you know, like somebody I care about who I never met, because the music was very important to me. And you know, and very able to express a lot. And so that death affected me a lot. And so then when I looked into the death, that affected me a lot. And I thought, well, really, you know, I pray for this person's, you know, to have wonderful rebirth, you know, but you know, our spiritual path has to have the right causes. So this is when he said that thing about trees and rocks. I was like, well, you know, I better think about this. You know. So to get the whole thing started, we have to understand the nature of suffering. We have to understand especially the third kind of suffering, the pervasive conditioned suffering. And we have to take that really to heart so that we have the motivation to actually change our situation. And I do consider this in the wisdom teachings, because to try to wrap your mind around the fact that our body and our mind are produced from karma and afflictions, I mean, that's not an easy pill to swallow. It wasn't my worldview, you know. But as you know, when you think about it, what that means, you know, I guess I really like, I think it was Geshe Sopa who, or maybe I read this in his book, but it's the idea that, you know, just on the, you know, like that, whatever's going on for you, you know, you might be feeling good or that, everything can change like that. There's no way that things are secure. So our body, our mind, they can change in a moment. There's whatever, because, why? Because it's in their nature to go towards suffering, you know, as long as they're, you know, affected by past negative karma and afflictions. And if you know, that part's harder to see. I can't see that part, but I can see that, you know, it's true. If you just look at your day, just how easy you can go from one state to another. It's so easy. It takes so little. And that's the thing about the pervasive, you know, conditioned suffering, that just with a very small change in conditions, you go into a suffering state. Don't you think that's true in your day? When I do something that irritates you, doesn't it happen quite quickly that you go into a suffering state? It didn't take much, you know. I mean, it's just, it's evident. And so this is what it's pointing to, you know. And so we have to really wrap our minds around that with a lot of, you know, a lot of examples in our lives, so that we can, if we don't get to that point, we will not follow this path. Because you have to have a motivation, and you have to convince yourself of these things. And we have to like debate, you know, I don't mean like the formal debate, but we have to have like the kind of discussions we had with Frederick about the second suffering, trying to explain to him how that worked, you know, just so we could clarify it to ourselves. So we have to think about these, because this is the catalyst. And then I wanted to go through this because we were talking about this sense of disgust that this has to lead you to, because that word intrigued me when I first ran into it. And these are the things, you have to pursue these things and settle them in your mind. Because I was like, forget that. I looked it up in many books. It was like maybe 8 years ago. I was like, I'm not so sure about that one. So what is that talking about? So this pervasive dukkha that is this catalyst, this is what helps us to want to seek liberation. When you understand this, then this sense of disgust will come up in you. And what do they mean by that? Because that word doesn't exactly work for all of us. So this is, again, going back to seeing the disadvantages of our afflictions and just how unstable things are. And we have to see the drawbacks, the flaws, the disadvantages of having afflictions, and then try to encourage ourselves to be separate from them. By understanding our afflictions, we have to understand those first in our own experience before we can get to the place where we'll actually even be able to understand the concept or the reality of having polluted aggregates. This is what His Holiness says in his commentary. And that's helpful because it's a little bit of a stretch for my mind to wrap around, this is like in the nature of suffering, this pervasive suffering. I just doesn't come to mind naturally when I look at my hand, But, in order to get to the place where I can see that and not want to be holding on to this body when I die, not all, like you were talking about, all this, like, am I comfortable? We have so much attachment to the body. And when we're carrying this thing around our whole lives, no matter how long we live, we're going to carry this thing around. And when we have to separate from it, as Venerable says, we're going to freak out. And I think she might be right. Because I don't do so well even just with it being uncomfortable. And so I have to see it for what it is. In order for me to get to that point, which is the pervasive condition, dukkha, I have to just recognize what's happening with afflictions in the day-to-day reality of how afflictions work. That's the thing that His Holiness is telling us here. Understanding the flaws of the disturbing emotions must precede understanding the flaws of the contaminated mental and physical aggregates. I think that makes sense. So we have to, it's like you got to go to grade 1 before you go to grade 2. You have to have these earlier understandings before the other ones will fall into place. And when we get to the place where we really see that, then we will have a very strong dislike for it. And that's what they're talking about with this disgust. We'll want to be liberated from that. So I like the word disillusioned. When I see it translated that way, it's a little easier for me because it kind of just fits. So that's something we need to do. So now we're going to talk a little bit about cultivating realizations again. And this is kind of, I think really he's explaining what analytical meditation is about in my mind. So when we want to cultivate realizations, we have to kind of know what the object of our attention is. We can't just kind of sit down and have a blank mind. This was the big, this went through every chapter in this book, the idea of about what is proper meditation and having, not having, you need to have an object of meditation. It's not, you can't have the thought that having full, like, single point of concentration is going to free you. It's only a temporary. It temporarily suppresses your afflictions. That's true, and it's quite useful that way. And as you develop it, you can even get your body more comfortable, because you can really. And I find this to be true because I work with pain pretty consistently, and I am finding that they teach this in a lot of chronic pain programs, and it works. You can help pain in that way, and so there'll come a point where you're meditating so well that you'll have like a mental kind of bliss, or pliancy that leads to a physical pliancy, leads to a physical bliss, leads to a mental bliss. all these things can happen. You don't even need to be a Buddhist. You can get to these stages. And those will suppress your afflictions, but they won't get rid of them, and they won't uproot them. So how do we go about that? Realizations. Well, you have to know what the object of your attention is. You have to have an object. And then you have to figure out what are the causes and conditions. How do you cultivate realizations? And then you do preparation for it. And this is no different, when he explains this. If you think about an example, think about when we learn about the 7-point cause and effect for generating bodhicitta. That's a really easy example. Right there, they lay out for us like a cookbook. These are the 6 causes. This is the result. This is exactly what he's talking about here. Anything that you're going to meditate on has that kind of analysis there. Maybe they didn't write it all out in our Lamrim outline, but that's what we need to do in our practice. And so when you gain familiarity, let's say, the 7-point cause and effect that helps to produce bodhicitta, for generating that, you gain familiarity with it and experience with it in your practice. There comes a place where you don't need to cultivate the understanding anymore. You've got kind of like the understanding of the topic, let's say. So then at that point, you use the analysis and you use the investigation in order to generate a very strong feeling that really moves your mind. This is what, when they talk about that switch from analytical meditation and then you stabilize on it, this is what he's talking about here. He didn't use those words, but he used the words more like, when you want to cultivate realizations, this is what he would call a contrived experience. We use all these reasonings, we use the scripture, the Dharma, quotations to kind of make this contrived experience. But then when that is contrived, and that's what we need to do. We make our mind familiar. But then when he's saying when it's uncontrived, then what will happen is at some time you'll encounter a situation where you, without relying on the reason or without relying on the quote, it will just come up. This strong feeling will automatically arise in your mind. This is an uncontrived experience. And we have those too. But it's good for us to recognize these because then we can cultivate them. When we look at our experience and we see how it works, this is, I think if you looked at your own experience, you would find that to be the case with the meditation that you've worked on. It's like the story Venerable told about the man in prison, and the guy was going to just, this guy was approaching him really in a very dangerous way, and just spontaneously he did Tonglen and a mantra, and just changed his whole energy from being fear-based, where he would react and probably have a big fight, to just this really state of mind that had no anger, was very clear, and was able to handle a very precarious situation. That arose spontaneously because of his practice. That what I would call uncontrived. That's just a really graphic example. And that's what we want to do with our analytical meditation. Wow, I've got too many more pages here. Just getting to the good stuff. Well, what to say? I have to make some choices here. Because there's very little time, I have to skip most of the next wonderful stuff, which is a drag. Maybe we'll just do it with us someday, because it was interesting. So we'll finish with this story about, since we talked about this a little bit, and we don't have time for this other stuff. All the stuff on insight. Sorry. Because we didn't get to it. So throughout this book, on numerous occasions, they talked about how that if you meditate and you have single-pointed concentration, it won't destroy your afflictions from the root. It won't get rid of this misconception of the self, right? And then they told this funny story that I thought was kind of a good way to end. So there was this non-Buddhist master called Udrak, and he meditated on calm abiding for a very long time, in the course of which his hair grew very long. And while I was completely absorbed in single-pointed meditation, concentration, some of his hair was eaten by rats. And as soon as he arose from his meditation, he saw that the rats had eaten his hair, and he became very angry, and all his afflictions came right back. And actually, I heard a story that was about I think he's Hindu. He was a teacher of a friend of mine. I'm not sure. I think he's Hindu. And he actually, and I met him, he never spoke. I met him once, and he never spoke because he had actually done 2 years of solitary retreat. And as soon as he came out, the first thing that happened is he yelled at somebody, and he just quit speaking after that for the rest of his life. He taught always by using a chalkboard. And it was the same as this story, exactly. It's like the proof. So we need to go beyond that. We need to go to the place where we take the teachings all the way through, understanding all the various philosophical texts as best as we can in this life, and plant the seeds for future lives to continue to do that, so that we can realize the emptiness, have direct perception of the emptiness, the lack of inherent existence of all of the self and of all phenomena. And then, we'll have a whole yak load of books that we've read and understood. So, and last piece of advice that he said, because I spent a lot of time on the meditation section, he said that if we haven't heard these kind of teachings, even that I gave tonight, that are like trying to set a basis for the following topics, if we haven't heard these type of teachings, the Bodhisattva collection he called it, and we also haven't implemented teachings, he said, of the monastic discipline, but he really means ethical conduct, then if we develop single-pointed concentration and we think that's enough, we'll fall into the pit of arrogance due to pride. You could see how that might happen, because it's quite an amazing, when you read about all the accomplishments that come with meditative stabilization, and I kind of think they might, because even in different traditions you hear some of the same stories, of what some of the things that sound kind of otherworldly to me, but if the different various kinds of abilities and powers and clairvoyance and whatever, and I think you've had a little story about that, the person that you met who had clairvoyant powers and didn't know ethical conduct. Would you say that there might have been some pride and arrogance in his makeup? Or maybe not, or just ignorance, or understatement. Yeah, because this person had to have, in some lifetime, he had to have had a lot of concentration ability, but it could have been in a previous lifetime, I've been told. You could have some clairvoyant powers in this life from previous life efforts. But if you don't have ethical conduct, and you just get, we don't recognize our arrogance very easily, especially when, we just don't need a little help with that a lot of times. So you could see how you could get stuck if you had all these abilities. So that's the warning, to take the whole teachings, even these 3 pots, to heart. So I better stop. Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore.